Good evening, blog viewers. Today we'll cycle back to the virtue of freedom and talk about freedom. I think we've blogged about it a few other times, but this, as opposed to some of the other virtues, this one has not really gotten going. Now, as with all the other virtues, freedom is a great thing, but even great things have their limit, and man is not, in that sense, infinitely free to do whatever he wants at any particular moment in time. At any particular moment in time, in fact, there seems to be various forces, limiting forces that in some way or other limit man's freedom from down from infinity to some sort of finite point. And so these limiting forces could be things like work responsibilities, obligations one has to friends and family, the need to follow various laws as part of a society, part of a political society. One's physical and mental abilities limit one's freedom to do certain things. Not everyone, I think the example that's commonly used is not everyone can be a NBA center, not everyone can be Albert Einstein. And of course the demands of everyday living, the need to fill up your car with gas, pay an electric bill, get various things done. So all of these things, in some way or other, limit man's freedom from, again, starting out from an infinite point where we have infinite freedom to something less than that. And so we go from either infinity to zero, where someone would be not free at all to do anything. And so most of us, in some way or another, at any particular point, we are somewhere in between those points. And I think most of the task of figuring out how to best exercise the virtue of freedom is to figure out where is that optimal point between infinity and zero for each of us. Because once we identify all of these limitations on our freedom, we have what's left is sort of a core zone of freedom is left. We've identified sort of things that curtail freedom in some way, shape, or form, and there's some zone left now where we can still be free and act freely. And part of the project of human good attainment is harnessing the power of that zone of freedom, literally going within that zone and using it and employing it in a way that we can get as much good out of the universe and life as we can. Again, this goes back to our notion, critically developed, I think, in a few of the other posts, that good, human good and good in general for man is almost limitless in the universe around us. There is almost Daddy, I'm on this thing. Okay, I'll be there in a second. There is almost an infinite amount of good surrounding us at any point in time, and the only thing, literally everything around us, can be conceived of as good, as in terms of the air, the sun that hits us, that warms us, even the material objects we use, this chair that I'm sitting on, the air I'm breathing. Almost everything, the views I'm seeing right now, the technology I'm using to record this, all these things are good, or can be used for good. They can also be used for other things, but fundamentally they are good. And so the only thing that's really bad in the universe is potentially sometimes sort of natural catastrophes, and also the badness of other human beings, including ourselves. So those are the two sort of what you could call the fly in the ointments in this universe that's fundamentally good and fundamentally beautiful. The badness of human beings, the badness of human morality, of people that are immoral in some sense, and again, including critically ourselves. Any badness in ourselves, any immorality in ourselves is the only sort of limitation on the goodness of the universe. So having said all that, I think in general all of this seems fairly difficult to dispute, but for various reasons I think many people don't really either don't think they have a lot of freedom when you talk to them, or they don't exercise as much freedom as one would imagine they should, or in general don't exercise much freedom at all. And that's rather strange in a country that is almost blessed with limitless political and social freedoms, that people don't exercise freedom that much. And I think usually people don't exercise certain rights or privileges or certain freedoms available to them because of certain mental roadblocks or certain things that are preventing them from recognizing that they could do that sort of thing, or they do have that right, or they do have that freedom. And so we have to think about what those roadblocks could be. And I want to turn to Isaiah Berlin again. I think we've blogged about Berlin as well. I'm using the Proper Study of Mankind. He wrote an essay called Historical Inevitability, in which he discusses one very significant roadblock to freedom. And he starts out with a quotation from T.S. Eliot's Notes Toward the Definition of Culture, in which he simply quotes Eliot for saying, "those vast impersonal forces." And already we get a sense then that Berlin sort of sees one a roadblock to man sort of exercising more freedom in the world is this view that sort of these vast, impersonal, larger-than-life forces are constantly sort of preventing man from being more free than he could be otherwise. Berlin thought that men are almost totally under this view. Berlin didn't think this himself, but he was sort of describing this kind of view. Under this kind of view, men are almost totally conditioned by their environment, whether that's their economic environment, their socio-economic class, whether that's their psychological sort of environment, whether it's their biological environment in terms of their genes, the genetics, whether it's their biography, their personal history, the sort of the accidental circumstances of their lives. All of these things, all of these huge impersonal forces, these things affect man, and they, under this view, really govern man's actions. I'm quoting from page 124 of the essay, Historical Inevitability, where Berlin writes here, the truer or deeper causes of human behavior lie not in the specific circumstances of an individual life, or in the individual's thoughts or volitions, but in a pervasive interrelationship between a vast variety of such lives with their natural and man-made environment. Men do as they do and think as they think, largely as a function of the inevitable evolution of the class as a whole. And that's at 124. At 139, he says, Berlin says, individual lives, both mental and physical, are governed by the larger wholes to which they belong. Again, that the working of these laws can only be grasped by those who realize that the lives, characters, and acts of individuals, both mental and physical, are governed by the larger wholes to which they belong. That's at 139. And at 128 he says, to believe that somehow human beings could sort of evade the total sort of determinism of their lives is to return to some sort of naive or primitive conception of man, to believe that people had sort of limitless freedom. What do you need? The keys to what? Oh, it's in front. Yeah, okay. Sorry about the distraction there. So to believe that somehow, we had limitless freedom is to, again, return to some sort of naive or primitive conception of man. And so we can sort of these things under this view, we can sort of be affected by these things and governed by sort of large impersonal forces, even while we're unaware of it. Berlin says that people can sort of happily play, under this view again, people can happily play their predestined part, but this again doesn't change the fact that they're still playing a predestined part. So under this view, again, historical inevitability, we're conditioned, we're determined, our choices, our trajectory of our lives, they're all sort of, it's like going on on a roller coaster. And when you get on it, there's really nothing else you can do but just sit. And so that's sort of the view that's coming forth through Berlin here, this viewpoint. You just sit, everything's sort of determined for you. You can't do anything but sort of just react passively to what's going on. There's a very small zone of freedom once you're actually on the roller coaster. And I think that's probably the best example I can give of it, a visual. And Berlin sees this view, interestingly, with regard to freedom, as being actually beneficial in some sense to the understanding of man, but also very pernicious. He thinks it's beneficial because it sort of reminds us that there is, again, a limit of human freedom, that various factors, like psychological factors, genetics, again, our past education, the trajectory of our lives, the choices that we've made, all of these things can and do have an effect on who we are and our choices and our freedoms. And this recognizing that and appreciating that prevents us from making sort of absolutist, cruel moral judgments on other people and on ourselves. When we realize that people may not have had many alternatives to the way they acted, or maybe could not have seen those alternatives because of the various circumstances in their lives, then we sort of gain a more balanced moral assessment of their situation. We have more compassion for what happened, or our own actions. We have more. We treat ourselves, or we assess ourselves morally in a more compassionate way. He says, what we cannot alter as much as we had supposed cannot be used as evidence for or against us as free moral agents. And so again, that what couldn't have been other than what it was, we can't sort of be morally held accountable for, and we shouldn't beat ourselves up over that. But on the other hand, so he sees sort of a positive dimension to that view of historical inevitability, and various other kinds of inevitabilities. He also sees it as very dangerous, and he sees it as dangerous in general because he believes it wipes out any notion of individual responsibility, freedom, and moral accountability. The moral pulse becomes sort of irrelevant under this view if it's taken too far. He says at 153 that no sooner do we acquire adequate insight into the inexorable and inevitable parts played by all things, animate and inanimate, in the cosmic process than we are freed from the sense of personal endeavor. Our sense of guilt and of sin, our pangs of remorse and self-condemnation are automatically dissolved. The tension, the fear of failure and frustration disappear as we become aware of the elements of a larger organic whole, of which we are variously described as limbs or members, or reflections, or emanations, or finite expressions. Our sense of freedom and independence, our belief in an area, however circumcised, in which we can choose to act as we please, falls from us. He says later at 156, and so individual responsibility and the perception of the difference between right and wrong choices, between avoidable evil and misfortune, are mere symptoms, evidence of vanity, of our imperfect adjustment of human inability to face the truth. The more we know, the greater the relief from the burden of choice. We forgive others for what they cannot avoid. And by the same token, we forgive ourselves. So there again, once this sort of view that we couldn't have done anything other than what we did, any sort of individual responsibility for past actions, any sort of moral culpability or a sense of shame is gone. We basically we forgive everything that we did. We sort of give ourselves a free pass on everything. We sort of go too far now on the other side of the side of the spectrum, and that Berlin saw as being very dangerous. And then again, the view is expressed here, same view here at 161. Berlin writes, we may neither applaud nor condemn individuals or groups, either because they cannot help themselves, or conversely because we know too little to know this, either or it's opposite. So again, once you can't condemn or applaud anyone that couldn't help being as they were, and so Berlin tries, after sort of pointing out what's useful in this view and pointing out what's dangerous in this view, he tries to sort of bring it all together, and I think he does a pretty good job at it. And he writes at 170, sort of bringing together on one hand the conception of sort of the need to be sort of balanced and humane and compassionate in our moral judgments based on all of these forces that sort of limit freedom, and then on the other hand not to go too far on the other extreme and sort of deny any sense of freedom at all. And Berlin writes here at 170, when everything has been said in favor of attributing responsibility for character and action to natural and institutional causes, when everything possible has been done to correct blind or oversimple interpretations of conduct which fix too much responsibility on individuals and their free acts, when in fact there is strong evidence to show that it was difficult or impossible for men to do otherwise than as they did, given their material environment or education, or the influence upon them of various social pressures, when every relevant psychological and sociological consideration has been taken into account, every impersonal factor given due weight, after all these severities, we can continue to praise and blame. We blame others as we blame ourselves, and the more we know, the more it may be we are disposed to blame. So he says here, a critical passage, once we take everything into account from that sort of externally limited or internally limited, the freedom of a particular person, whether when we take all of these forces into account, when we understand how difficult it was or impossible for someone to act otherwise than as they did, when we take every relevant psychological sort of interpretation into account, then, even then, he says, rather than sort of forgetting about the task of judging other people or ourselves and sort of denying the human freedom or volitional act, we still find an area there. After we've taken all that into account, we still have an area there to make assessments and find and locate zones of freedom. And that is sort of, I think, with Berlin's view, that is the sort of the fair and balanced way to sort of judge people and judge ourselves. And he says, again, he says here at 176, if we do condemn societies or individuals, we shall do so only after taking into account their social and material conditions, their aspirations, codes of values, degrees of progress and reaction, measured in terms of their own situation and outlook. So it's a judgment that still judges and still understands the limits of human freedom while not denying it after taking into account all these other limiting factors. Now, I think Berlin, he makes clear in his essay that it's the sort of the rare person that can understand the extent of the freedom that actually exists in his life, that's not willing to sort of blame other people or other forces or other vast impersonal forces for everything that went wrong in his life. He thinks that's sort of that takes a sort of a rare, sort of courageous, intellectually honest person that can do that. He says at 185, some human beings have always preferred the peace of imprisonment, a contented security, a sense of having at last found one's proper place in the cosmos, to the painful conflicts and perplexities of the disordered freedom of the world beyond the walls. So most people, Berlin thinks, don't want to sort of locate the freedom that they've had. They'd rather sort of be content with whatever life they're living and content with whatever situation they have without sort of really examining how they could act differently or how they could have acted differently to get to that point. That's at 185. And at 189 he says that sort of this desire not to locate exactly the zone of freedom is driven by, he says, it seems to me to spring from a desire to resign our responsibility, to cease from judging, provided we ourselves are not judged, and above all are not compelled to judge ourselves, from a desire to flee for refuge to some vast, amoral, impersonal, monolithic whole, nature, or history, or class, or race, or the, quote, harsh realities of our time, or the irresistible evolution of the social structure that will absorb and integrate us into its limitless, indifferent, neutral texture, which is senseless to evaluate or criticize, and against which we fight to our certain doom. This is an image which has often appeared in the history of mankind, always at moments of confusion and inner weakness. It is one of the great alibis pleaded by those who cannot or do not wish to face the fact of human responsibility, the existence of a limited but nevertheless real area of human freedom. Again, that notion of a zone of freedom, conditioned and sort of surrounded by all sides by limiting forces, but still very real, still very potent, still very there, but still most people not preferring to see it, most people running from it, most people ignoring it, and sort of much more content to blame sort of vast forces for any sort of lack of freedom in their life or any prior exercises of freedom. So I think, in general, we've laid out Berlin's view. I think the account of freedom that comes through Berlin here is quite realistic. It both affirms the potential of human freedom, limited freedom, while recognizing the legitimate limitations to it. Due to various forces that have real forces, legitimate things that actually limit human freedom. I think what Berlin would encourage us to do, if he was alive today, would be to look in our personal lives very closely and locate these zones of freedom. Figure out what are the sort of limitation points, what are the things that sort of condition who we are, but still within that find the zone of freedom and sort of and use it as much as we can, rather than sort of blaming everything on vast impersonal forces or larger or sort of the harsh realities of our time, things of that sort. I think this is likely to be a trial and error process as we continue to locate very precisely like what exactly we can take responsibility for personally, and what still resides in that zone of personal freedom versus what really has been conditioned by social forces and genetics and psychological explanations and all those things. It's not, I don't think it's going to be, it's not an easy thing to discover for most people, and it probably requires a lot of stops and starts where we actually realize, something that we thought would be within our zone of freedom is actually more governed by sort of the forces outside of it. But I think in general, most of us will discover, as Berlin sort of hints, that human freedom is still real. We still have more freedom, much more freedom than we think we did. With respect to various past events, we were not forced entirely into any decision that we had. It was a free decision, largely a free decision, or maybe substantially a free decision that we made. We should accept the moral responsibility for that, for our prior actions. We should take the blame for them. If there was a bad action, we should be properly ashamed of it, and recognize that we still have the freedom to correct that. We still have the freedom to locate that freedom and develop and harness that freedom to find good. And all of this, to me, seems like a very balanced moral assessment and a very humane assessment of human freedom. And I think Berlin was, as I think, very, unlike many of the thinkers we've studied, really focused on understanding man as he really is, and understanding and making humane sort of judgments of people, not sort of hard-hearted, insensible, sort of really cruel judgments that sort of deny the realities of human life. But I think Berlin gets it almost perfectly right here, and so we'll have to continue looking at different ideas on freedom and seeing how they harmonize with Berlin's, and how we can sort of build on what he's imparted to us. And so we'll do that very soon. Bye bye.